History is filled with brutal and tragic chapters, and women, in particular, have suffered greatly, often becoming victims of harsh laws and cultural traditions. Throughout the centuries, women have been subjected to horrifying tortures and punishments, often simply for not conforming to rigid societal standards. One of the most brutal and humiliating punishments for women in the past was execution by drowning in a sack. This method was widely used in medieval Europe, and its purpose was not only to punish, but also to ensure that the individual had no chance of survival. The punishment was typically applied to women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or even minor social offenses. The procedure was as follows. The woman was placed in a sack, along with heavy stones or other weights to ensure she would drown. In some cases, animals, such as snakes or cats, were added to the sack to intensify the victim's suffering. This execution was often carried out in public places, such as bridges or docks, to serve as a public lesson for others. The brutality and symbolic cruelty of the execution emphasized how powerless women were during that time. This punishment was especially common against those who had no means to defend themselves in court. Women were not given a chance to prove their innocence. The execution was a final verdict, and the body of the drowned woman was often left in the river as a symbol of sin and punishment. Throughout history, there have been punishments aimed not only at inflicting physical pain, but also at destroying human dignity. One of the most humiliating methods was the public stripping of women, a practice employed in many cultures and eras. Public nakedness for humiliation was most commonly used when a woman was accused of adultery or violating social norms. The punishment took place in central squares or other crowded areas where the crowd could witness the process. The woman was forced to walk naked through the city or village and sometimes was tied to a pillory. During this procedure, she might be pelted with mud, stones, spat on, or even flogged. This was often accompanied by jeers and mockery from the crowd, making the punishment unbearable both physically and mentally. In some cases, women were forced to wear humiliating signs or placards indicating their guilt. For example, in medieval Europe, those accused of adultery were sometimes bound with special belts symbolizing the defilement of their honor. Among the most brutal and twisted methods of torture devised in ancient times, one stands out, the method known as scaphism, or torture by milk and honey. This barbaric form of torment was so horrific that it is hard to imagine even in modern times. Scaphism was an ancient Persian execution used on enemies of the state or those accused of serious crimes, including treason. However, there are also references to this punishment being applied to women. The procedure was as follows. The victim was stripped and tied to a wooden trough or small boat in such a way that her arms and legs were immobilized, with her head and limbs left exposed. She was then forced to drink large quantities of milk and honey, causing her stomach to become severely upset. After this, her body, especially her face and limbs, was smeared with honey. The bound victim was left out in the sun near swamps or forests, where insects and animals would begin to attack her. Bees, flies, and other insects were drawn to the sweet smell of the honey and gradually began to cause unbearable pain. But this was only part of the torture. The forced feeding of milk caused extreme gastrointestinal distress, and the excrement left under her body attracted even more insects. The process continued for days, and sometimes even weeks. The victim would slowly die from infection, dehydration, and insect bites. Torture with thorns, also known as thorning, was used throughout various historical periods, from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. This method was particularly common in Europe and was employed not only as a form of punishment, but also as a means of obtaining confessions, particularly in the context of the Inquisition. Thorns could be embedded in various torture devices, on benches, in foot or hand rests, or in special garments. One of the most well-known instruments of torture was the iron bench with spikes onto which victims were bound. It consisted of a wooden platform with numerous metal spikes protruding from it. The victim was forced to sit or lie on it, causing excruciating pain from the spikes penetrating the body. Particular attention should be given to devices like the iron virgins, structures with spikes inside which closed around the victim like a coffin. Women or men placed inside these devices suffered as the spikes pressed forcefully against their bodies, causing internal injuries. However, death did not come immediately. The torment could continue for hours or even days. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance were times of horrifying persecution, especially towards women accused of witchcraft. One of the most cruel and torturous methods was the use of the so-called witch's bridle. The witch's bridle was specifically designed to punish women accused of witchcraft or heresy. The device consisted of an iron band placed around the victim's head. It was equipped with metal spikes that would pierce the tongue if the woman attempted to speak or cast spells. Court records related to the witch hunts in Europe mention the witch's bridle as one of the popular instruments of torture used to silence women. The torture was employed during Inquisition trials, for example, in England and the Holy Roman Empire during the 16th and 17th centuries. The process was painful and dangerous. If the bridle was tightened too much, it could lead to damage to the tongue, lips, or even the oral cavity. In South America, particularly during the colonial periods when indigenous peoples often faced harsh treatment from colonizers, one of the most painful methods of torture was known as salted wounds. This method was used both as a punishment and as a means of intimidating women, especially under slavery. The process was as follows. The captured woman was often subjected to flogging or physical abuse. Afterward, the wounds from the blows were rubbed with salt. Salt, being an irritating and dehydrating substance, caused excruciating pain and intensified inflammation, leading to prolonged suffering. This torture not only inflicted physical agony but also had the potential to cause wound infections, as the damaged skin became vulnerable to bacteria. The sand burial method, used in some Arab countries, was one of the most brutal forms of execution. The condemned woman was buried in sand, leaving her exposed to the scorching sun, making her vulnerable to heat and dehydration. The sand covering her body not only restricted movement but also intensified the heat, turning the ordeal into a prolonged and agonizing death. Some historical sources suggest that this method was employed as a punishment for serious crimes such as adultery or political offenses, though specific historical examples are relatively rare. The woman was buried in such a way that only her head remained visible, rendering her immobile and unable to survive without assistance. The relentless sun burned her skin, and the sand gradually filled her airways, depriving her of oxygen. The process was excruciating and could last from several hours to several days, until the victim succumbed to thirst, suffocation, or heat stroke. Public dragging was a form of torture in which the accused woman was tied to a horse or another animal and dragged across the ground in front of a crowd. This method was used to publicly punish the woman and emphasize her guilt in the eyes of society. Tied to the animal, the woman endured extreme physical suffering as her body was repeatedly slammed against the ground, and her skin and muscles were scraped, sometimes down to the bone. This could lead to bleeding, fractures, and internal injuries. Lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts, was a punishment in which the victim was subjected to numerous cuts before dying. This method of execution was used in ancient China and was particularly common among women accused of conspiring against the emperor or committing treason. Despite its extreme cruelty, it was not rare in the history of ancient China, especially during times when the ruling power demanded absolute obedience. The execution process began with the condemned person being tied to a pillar or placed in another immobile position, after which the executioner would begin making cuts across the body. Initially, these were light, superficial cuts that did not cause immediate death, but with each subsequent strike, the pain grew more intense. Eventually, when the blood loss became too great or the internal organs were damaged, the victim would die. However, lynching was abolished at the end of the 19th century, when China began to modernize, and such executions were deemed too cruel even for traditional society. History is full of dreadful and cruel methods of punishment, which often serve not only as instruments of torture, but also as symbols of power and fear. Each of these methods has left its mark on history, reminding us of the importance of human dignity and justice. If you're interested in such dark and thought-provoking topics, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new videos. Also, be sure to check out our other videos, where we continue to explore the most terrifying events and stories from the past.